The courtroom clears. He kind of stands up. The marshals are on each side of him. And an agent from across the courtroom yells over, "Hey, Fitz!" The judge is gone, so you can talk in a courtroom at this point. And all of a sudden, I'm behind Kaczynski on an angle, maybe about 20 feet, like in the second row, and the first row kind of is cleared out already. My fellow agents, about 20 feet to Kaczynski's right behind him. First, Kaczynski's head goes right. Look who yelled that and where that guy is looking, and he can tell by the other agent's gaze in the direction he's looking. He then looks over at me, and I go like this to the agent, like, "Yeah, I'll meet you outside in a minute." And Kaczynski our eyes then meet, and he gives me the longest, strangest, quite frankly, borderline scariest eye-to-eye stare down I've ever experienced.
Welcome back to Code Red, everybody. I'm Ray, and as always, here with Fitz. This is a special episode of Code Red. Fitz and I were talking earlier today, and today is June 10th, 2023. And we became aware earlier today that Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber, was found unresponsive in a cell. And so we thought we'd come on and give some closing remarks about Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber, and some of the ups and downs that occurred during the investigation, and how Fitz actually closed this out. Fitz, if you can you take us back to when you first got involved in this? And I don't know we need to go in detail. You talked about this before, but I think in this, it kind of, I'd like to know where the starting point is. And I know this started in 1975 with some of the bombings, but when you really got involved in this, Fitz, what was that? What was that like? What was that about?
Ray, I'm going to answer all these questions, and we've already mentioned the Unabomber's name, but I'm going to start my little bit here with three names first. They are Hugh Scruton, they are Thomas Moser, and they are Gilbert Murray. They are the three people murdered by the Unabomber, Ted Kaczynski. So while Ted died today in prison, peacefully in his sleep, I guess everyone ideally in their 80s would want to, go that way, if not beyond. These three people were blown up, at least one of them in front of his wife and young daughter, who could have also been killed, but luckily weren't. So there's nothing anyone hears today from me is going to be any kind of sympathetic or sad because of his death. He's where he should be. But we'll get back to some of that stuff down the line here. And actually, June 10th is a pivotal moment in this investigation, but I'll come back to that as we go on a little bit farther here. Yeah, basically, FBI come in 1987, first office New York, 7 years, promoted to supervisory special agent in 95, to Quantico as a profiler in the profiling unit, later called the behavioral analysis unit. 12 weeks of training with John Douglas, just as he's getting ready to retire. He gives a 2-hour block on the Unabomber case, which was unsolved then. And this is June or so of 95, one of the last classes I took before we finished this little mini academy on how to be a profiler. And little did I know, after this block, and I talked to Douglas a little bit afterwards about some of the things he wrote and this manifesto coming out, which no one had seen yet. And little did I know that the torch was being passed to me, figuratively speaking, by John Douglas at that point. I go away for a week or two on vacation, get a phone call. "Hey, Jim, how about heading out to San Francisco for 30 days? There's a Unabomber task force out there now. The New York Times is about to get this manifesto, which the Unabomber sent to them. If you publish this, I'll stop killing, bombing people to kill them." And they send me out for 30 days. They like the work I'm doing, and we discussed some of this on earlier podcasts and certainly in my book, A Journey to the Center of the Mind, Manhunt Unabomber. There's all kinds of ways of referencing this. And then 9 months later, we had the Unabomber in custody. Of course, his brother David Kaczynski played a role, but we still had to build the case after we got a phone call adding Ted Kaczynski to the list of 2,500 suspects we had at the time. So it was a question of putting everything together there. And and looking basically at the language in the writings of the Unabomber, finally having a viable suspect. This one, Ted Kaczynski, the brother and the mother saved all his documents he wrote over the year, sent it to the task force. I started comparing them, and we had a lot of good clues, but the final one came in. You can't eat your cake and have it too. That was paragraph 185 of the manifesto, a distinctive transposition of the verbs in that axiom. And then we finally found that in the letter to the editor he wrote to Saturday Evening Magazine in the early 1970s. That was one of the letters that the mother saved, turned it over to us, and that was our linguistic smoking gun. The arrest was made April 3rd of 96, and he's been in custody from that very day until today, except he's not walking out on his own. He's being carried out in a coffin or casket of some sort, and he'll be in the ground where he belongs very shortly.
Jim, there was quite a few agents over the years that worked this, and you happened to come in at the end and kind of put the final pieces of the puzzle together with this thing. But what is that like coming in? Because that kind of happened with me on a couple different cases where someone's carried that torch for a long time, and then you come in and you wind up taking it home, as you might say. But there was a lot of agents, a slew of agents that had the opportunity to work that and just were never able to kind of close it out until you were able to see inside something that was written that nobody had even thought of before. It was kind of new. It was a whole new science to the Bureau. If you really, I mean, to be honest, you kind of brought that to the FBI. I mean, there was statement analysis, but not to the level that you took it to, Jim.
Well, it was weird. We're all a family in the FBI, but Ray, as well as you may know your squad in Philly pretty well, and a few of the folks around you in different squads. But you get sent to a different division, and especially one 3,000 miles away, where no one. Yeah, we all carried the little gold badge. We're all armed. We powers of arrest. We went through Quantico, but we're still feeling each other out early on. And I wore this shirt a few months ago on one of our podcasts, but I want to hold up again. I'm not wearing it today, but it was a team effort. I did not do this on my own. I never pretended to. Even in the miniseries Manhunt Unabomber, I made sure that the writers put in that other folks were involved. But we came, we analyzed, we arrested, and there's the Golden Gate Bridge in the mountains where the cabin was located, whatever, for the Unabomber task force. So it was a team effort, but my bosses, kind of saw something in me. I'd found some clues in the writings, in the manifesto, and some other letters that no one had seen before. And they said, "Hey, Fitz, I know you're new out here. I know you're a new profiler, but you're a seasoned investigator. You were a police officer 11 years before. We think you're a good fit." A lot of the folks on the Unabomber task force had counterintelligence backgrounds, which is good. It's an important position in the Bureau. But this was a criminal case, and they liked someone such as me who had 7 years of criminal work in New York City, bank robberies, extortions, all kinds of things like that, but also even as a police officer. And I could talk to cops on the street, some of the ones who were the first ones at the crime scenes of the Unabomber. So I think I was a good fit that regard. And as I've said in other venues, I've always been an avid reader. I was not a linguist when I came on board the task force. I am now after my second master's that I attained at Georgetown in 2005. But I was not. But I was an aficionado. I better be able to say that word right if I am an aficionado of language, of linguistics. And I used to always do a lot of reading, crossword puzzles, Scrabble, things like that. And I just had a way with words. And it kind of came to me naturally. And I could read something one day and remember where I saw it, a week or sometimes even a year later. So it was just, people talk about luck, but I really believe luck is, opportunity and preparation that comes together at that same time. And they gave me the opportunity. The prepping was all my life of being an avid reader. I'm not a good math guy, but when it comes to English language, I just have kind of a photographic memory of things I've seen and things I've I've read over the years, and that all came into play in the Unabomber case.
You know, I must say, Jim, you do have a way with words, but we'll save that for another time, or our listeners here. But you really do have a way with words, Jim.
Well, let me have a drink of water here. And anyone who knows this case, that word comes into play here and how I just pronounced it, as opposed to water.
Water.
You're a water guy, Ray, because we're both
a water
from Philly.
guy. Yeah, I am a water guy.
I say water now a little more than I say water. But that was a clue in the Unabomber case. If you read my book or watched the miniseries.
Yes, I did. Well, here's a question for you. And you and I have known each other for so long, but what was it like the first time that you came face to face with this guy? What was it like? I mean, people would love to know, what was your first impression? I mean, you know this guy behind the scenes and everything you're reading and you're looking at in the investigation, and then you come face to face with him. And what's the first thing that goes through your mind, Jim?
Well, first of all, it was a weird and an odd relationship, and we've been there, Ray. You with various cases, and me with other cases. But you have a criminal, you have a bank robber, a violent offender, Center City rapist. We've referenced that case a few times, and Arthur Bomar, the serial killer out in suburban Philadelphia, and you feel you know that person even before he's identified, and you feel you know something about him, not name and address, of course, that would be ideal, but you feel you know something about this person. Well, that's how it was with me and the Unabomber. That's the only name I knew him by when I first got put on the task force. And of course, I've been reading articles about this guy since 1978, the first bombing, and I'm trying to get in my head, through the early years, then my profiling training, listen to John Douglas and how his profiles evolved from the early 80s to the mid 90s. And then I got involved. We had the benefit of the manifesto, and we could enhance the profile from there. And we really started tightening it to get this guy, get the age closer to what he was, get his educational level closer to what it was. And I really felt that I was getting comfortable knowing this man. I've always been a reader of Sherlock Holmes and some of his arch enemies that he would go up against. Sometimes they had odd names, whatever. But it wasn't until that once Kaczynski was identified in February of '96, and we learned that he was a former professor at Berkeley. Right away, the character from Sherlock Holmes, Professor Moriarty, came to mind, right, who was his sort of arch nemesis through at least one short story and one novel, I think. And I kind of saw Kaczynski as my personal Professor Moriarty. I mean, the storyline was different, and Moriarty dealt more in the public, and he had other relationships, unlike Kaczynski, locked in his cabin in the middle of nowhere all these years, but still a professor, still very brilliant. And luckily we had no Reichenbach Falls situation where it looks like both parties fall off the cliff and die. But of course, only Moriarty died, and that was his end. So in a way, Kaczynski fell off his Reichenbach Falls today, and he is no longer with us. But yeah, I felt through the manifesto. It's rare, Ray, to as you would know, to have a manifesto of someone. We talk about the Nashville case, and we'd love to read that, both as investigators, as profilers, as linguists, but also how to prevent the next person who may have similar ideology from committing those crimes. Well, here we didn't have a person in Unabomber identified yet, but we had his manifesto, and we could read through it, and I read through it with a fine-tooth linguistic comb. And with the only case I was working that time, that's a rare luxury, as you know, in the FBI. Even the biggest of cases, you still have to put out little fires with other ones you're working and dealing with the courts and assistant U.S. attorneys and things like that. But pretty much once I was on Unabomber, that was the only thing I was doing. I was very focused. And I said, man, it's been 17 years. Can I possibly make a difference in this? And some of my bosses out there thought I could. They gave me some leeway, some autonomy, let me put a team together. And we really focused on the language in that case because it was a treasure trove of language. No one ever had a case like this before, where you had a criminal that insisted on writing as much as he did to the media, to some of his victims, of course, and even to others in the mix there. And we had 14 different letters. The manifesto itself was 35,000 words, 56 typewritten pages. So a lot of evidence there, and language is certainly a window to the soul, to the heart, to the mind of an individual. Someone can say "F you." That tells you something about the person. But if you get that same expression over 56 pages, you can get a lot more of that person besides just the very basic invective there. So, and that's the advantage we had. And we could really tighten that profile together. And we knew, based on everything we read and the team I was supervising, when the right person was identified, we could finally say, aha, that is our guy. And once the name Kaczynski came up, and again, he wasn't the first suspect, not by any stretch, or the only suspect in early 96. But once his name came up, and I was given some other paperwork to look at that he wrote back in the early 70s, another treatise he wrote only for his brother's eyes, but the brother turned it over to the FBI. I said, you've got your man. And that's when they brought me back out to UTF. And the next 8 weeks, we focused really hard, and actually 6 weeks make that. And we finally made the arrest on April 3rd of 96.
Jim, I know you were traveling today, and you haven't heard this, but I heard in the news, and I don't have all the details, that earlier today, or maybe late yesterday, the family of the offender in the Nashville shooting has released a manifesto, not to law enforcement, but to the families of the victims, so that they know what's going on. It's kind of sketchy what I have in reference to that, but that's something that maybe we can talk about next time.
Sure.
As we're dedicated to this. But I just so with a point of clarification when you brought that up, here's the second thing, and here's a question that I wanted to ask you. And I know this because I've been through it, and I know you've been through it. But when I'm looking at someone and I'm chasing something, I have a set expectations based upon what I've learned about the person. Although I don't know who the person is, but I've learned about the person through either documents, through informants, through all different types of means. But then I come in and I meet the person, and my expectations of who this person is versus what I'm coming face to face with. Did you get that feeling that when you saw him, you went, I didn't expect this. I expected something different. And I mean, compared to what you're talking about, a professor and then finding a guy in a log cabin.
Yeah, and that was your question of a few minutes ago, which I didn't specifically answer. And I hate to disappoint some people sometimes that have watched Manhunt Unabomber, a very, very well-made series, well-written. I always say it's about 85% accurate. There was no Jim Fitzgerald, Ted Kaczynski interaction at all. Kaczynski did not interact with any FBI agent until, once he was transported for his arraignment that day. And he barely answered any questions, even when he first had handcuffs slapped on him. So my only interaction with him was in the courtroom in January of 1998 in Sacramento, California. That's where the jurisdiction was for the Unabomber's trial, if it ever had taken place. But he ultimately decided to plead guilty through his attorneys. And my interaction was there. I was in the room when Thomas Moser's widow, Susan Moser, stood up and gave her sort of victim statement and basically wished Kaczynski to go into the deepest fires of hell, which I would say is where he is right now. So she got her wish there, even though it took some 27 years later. But when everything was over, the judge hit the gavel, court dismissed, you're off to prison for the rest of your life, Mr. Kaczynski, 2 consecutive terms, life imprisonment. The courtroom clears. He kind of stands up. The marshals are on each side of him. And an agent from across the courtroom yells over, "Hey, Fitz!" Because the judge is gone, so you can talk in a courtroom at this point. And all of a sudden, I'm behind Kaczynski on an angle, maybe about 20 feet, like in the second row. And the first row kind of is cleared out already. My fellow agents are, about 20 feet to Kaczynski's right behind him. First, Kaczynski's head goes right. Look who's who yelled at and where that guy is looking, and he can tell by the other agent's gaze in the direction he's looking. He then looks over at me, and I go like this to the agent, like, yeah, I'll meet you outside in a minute. And Kaczynski then, our eyes then meet, and he gives me the longest, strangest, quite frankly, borderline scariest eye-to-eye stare down I've ever experienced. I wasn't afraid physically of this guy. He wasn't a big man. That doesn't even matter. But he had no weapons, of course. He was getting handcuffs again by the marshals. But it's just like there's a guy staring at me. He knows my name from the affidavit. A lot of the court documents, they were arguing back and forth. Fitzgerald's affidavit and the part of the Turchi affidavit, whatever, in which my 50 pages of the language of the Unabomber compared to Kaczynski were used to get the search warrant for his cabin. So he knew all about Fitzgerald, and he looked at me, and as I've said before, if somehow he could have constructed a mental IED, improvised explosive device, in his brain and sent it in my direction, he would have gladly done so and blown me up right there on the spot. He did not like me. He did not want any parts of me. I have no doubt whether he's capable of hate or not. I don't know, but he definitely would have liked to see me harm right then, and I could see that in these eyes. People describe Charles Manson's eyes or his stare as breaching the soul of the individuals who may have experienced it. I'm not sure what Manson would have done to me in that regard. But Kaczynski, for about the 30 seconds he maintained that stare until the marshals kind of grabbed him by the arm and marched him out of the room. He had my attention, and I knew if he ever had a chance to get a bomb made somehow, somewhere in either the Supermax where he was up until about a year and a half ago, or in the medical center, Federal Medical Center, Butner in North Carolina, he would have done it, and he would have sent it to me. So that's my one interaction with him. Never spoke with him, never talked to him. I did try to set up an interview with him in 2007, put that in my book. That kind of fell apart. When we were doing the miniseries, the director and the head writer said, hey, reach out to Ted and maybe we can have, Sam Worthington, the final scene, will be sitting with the Unabomber, and this is like the 20-year later interview, something like that. And but Kaczynski never responded to that letter. So my chance of ever interviewing Kaczynski, a behavioral interview to find out what made him tick, why he killed the people he did, why he felt he had to do it, we'll never know.
Here's a couple things, and just for our listeners, you need to think about this. For someone to stare at you for 30 seconds, think about stare at something for 30 seconds and time yourself, and then look away. Imagine someone staring at you for that amount of time. And when you talk about Charles Manson and you talk about Arthur Bomar, look at tapes of Charles Manson and look at his eyes. They're black. There's no life in it. And when you look at that and that's pure evil. But I shouldn't say I must. I have to wonder, Jim, that when he hears Fitz, now he's read that affidavit 5 times.
Many,
Right,
probably 50 times.
At least that. So he's trying to figure out, and he's trying to put a name. How did I get here? Who put me here? And one of the reasons why he was there was because of you. So when he hears that Fitz, is he more inquisitive to who are you first, and then when he finds out who you are, then comes the death stare,
Yeah, because he was so careful with fingerprints and even the early days of DNA analysis and other types of indented writing. None of that was present in his missives to the New York Times. Nothing on the bombing devices themselves. What got him caught is his own language. Of course, his brother played a role in that too, but we still had to build the case after his brother called us and said, my brother, maybe the Unabomber, maybe not. Here's some documents. Okay, we had to build the case from there. So, but he knew it was his own language. And people have asked me to this day, I think they asked me two questions. If the brother didn't turn him in, would you ever have caught him? Yes, I was already proposing a long-term project that I would have gladly supervised back then, of going out to every newspaper and magazine in the country. This is a lot of kind of before the internet was even up and running too much, mid 90s, and go into some of their archives and the old, in their files with the microfiche and microfilm, and looking for letters. And we have like about a dozen categories, anti-capitalism and anti-big business, all those types of things. And a lot of the themes that were found in the manifesto. I think we would have eventually found Theodore J. Kaczynski, Lombard, Illinois, as the author, because he signed all these things with his real name, because he wrote, a dozen or more letters to different newspapers and magazines from the 70s on. So I think we would have identified a guy named Ted Kaczynski. Would have been a number of other suspects out there, but we would have at least followed through on him, found out where he's living, his background, and hopefully we'd be able to put the case together at that point. The other question, though, is if he never wrote anything, if he only made the bombs and sent them out, which were really his first, kind of the first iteration of his bombings, the first 12, I believe. There were only 2 ruse letters. They're pretty short. We'll come back to that in a minute. But if he didn't write his manifesto and other letters to victims that were much longer, then we may never have solved this case. So again, it was his own language that brought him down. And before I get sidetracked with your good questions, Ray, interestingly, the first Unabomber document was this 4th bombing sent to, actually, this was his 3rd bombing, sorry. It was sent to the president of United Airlines, Percy Wood, and in 1980, and that became the cornerstone, the very first document. We called it U1 for Unabomber 1. It was a ruse letter to trick Percy Wood into opening up a book that had been hollowed out with a device put inside, a bombing device, a plunger with a spring hook to it. Once the cover opened up, it blew up in his face, didn't kill him, but severely injured him and disfigured him. Guess what the date was of that first letter that he ever wrote?
June 10th.
June 10th, 1980. When does Ted Kaczynski die? June 10th, 2023. So the element of language, the aspect of language, which is what eventually brought him down and led to the loss of his physical freedom, was dated the same day as he lost his physical life, if you will. So coincidence? Most likely, yes, but nonetheless, there are significant moments in life of karma and issues such as that sometimes come together for a reason. So June 10th plays a significant role in his life. The first letter he ever wrote as a serial bomber, which eventually was used to identify him, and he dies on the anniversary of that date, 43 years later.
Did anybody ever have the opportunity to speak with the Unabomber while he was incarcerated? Was there anybody on any level? I know you said you never had the opportunity to interact with him other than that one time in court, but was there anybody at any time that you're aware of that had the opportunity to interact with him?
Well, a lot of people became his pen pal. I know that's an old-fashioned term, but you can't do emails from prison. He had many people writing him from all over the world. And I forget the exact time frame or timeline of this, but one of them was a woman who claimed to be a journalist for someone. I think she was more of a blogger back early 2000s. A few letters here and there, back and forth. He finally permitted her to visit. I think she was relatively young, like in her early 30s. He's at this point in his 60s. And she visits him once in the Supermax, twice. I think she even maybe moved into Colorado for a while. And this is a remote part of Colorado, Florence. And basically, they fall in love. And they get engaged to be married. And let me remind everyone here, Supermax, you can get visitors if you're good behavior and all that kind of stuff, but there is no conjugal visits, anything like that. In fact, there's no touching at all. You've seen movies and TV where they're sitting in a large room and they can hold hands and the little kids next to them, whatever. But no, it's an inch thick plexiglass window in between you and your guest. You're on the phone on one side, he or she's on the phone or the other, and that's how they talk. The best they can do is hold their fingers up to each other while not actually talking. So he fell in love with that woman. They were going to get married, and she was diagnosed with cancer. It's a sad story. And I think it came to the point she couldn't visit anymore. She became so sick. He went on a writing craze to different doctors, medical centers. I don't think she had insurance. He was trying to get collect money for her, set up a fund for her, whatever. But it was all for naught in the long run, and she died. And the one thing that escaped him his whole life was a successful relation. His whole life as a free man, so to speak, was that of a successful relationship with a woman. He wrote, I read his diary. He never had sex with a woman. He was a straight guy. He had some sexual confusion for a while when he was at University of Michigan. He wanted to transition to a woman. He actually met with a university psychologist. He's out there working on his PhD then. And the psychologist listened to him, and this is all in Ted's diary. I read it. And yes, you want to be a woman? Okay. You think you'd be happier? Okay. Well, here's the deal. We do a therapy sessions for several years. Then we put you on medications for several years. And then if everything is still proceeding at that point, we'll consider doing the surgery. And this is like 1966. So this is way before the transition surgeries we hear about today. But he got so upset that he had to wait, 4 to 5 years for any kind of a surgery to take place. He said to himself, the hell with it, I'm out of here. And as he's walking out the door, he wrote years later in his diary, he decided that psychiatrist is the kind of person he wants to kill. And damn it, someday he will kill that kind of person. It took him about from there it was about 20 years to start his bombings in 1978. But sure enough, he did. I don't think he ever had a psychiatrist as a target, but he picked up other representational targets after that, and he killed them, and he severely injured them, almost brought a jetliner down. He didn't even know who those people were, and that would have been 220 people he killed. It did blow up. It did do damage to the aircraft, but because the pilots were trained to handle an emergency landing, they successfully made it on the ground, and with only a dozen or so minor injuries. So, that's the legacy of this guy. Interesting, Robert Hansen died this week in the Supermax. They were in the same institution for decades together. Well, at least 2 decades, I guess. Hansen was only arrested the early 2000s. But it was solitary confinement there. If they ever saw each other, it was a nod of the head. And they didn't eat their meals together. They didn't work out together. Everyone was in isolation, and but they were coincidentally in the same institution at the same time.
Jim, you talk about the victims here, and the victims. We should never forget about the victims. That's the real tragedy here. But a lot of people would like to know, if based upon your involvement in this case and the reading of the diary and the reading of the manifesto, how did he choose his victims? Were they specifically selected, or were they just random?
Well, in his early days, he would place bombs on occasion and just wait at an institution of which he disapproved. And these were usually universities. And so a few of his early victims were just put on tables in inside of a hall at the end of a classroom facility, and a few people picked them up. One guy, last name Hauser, forget his first name, but he was also at Berkeley. He was he was ready to be an astronaut. He was in the Air Force. He was going to be an astronaut on the space shuttle, and he just picked up this device. What is this? It blew up. It blew his hand blew his hand apart so viciously that his Air Force Academy ring, the finger itself, blew up against the sheetrock wall, and you can see the impression in the sheetrock wall of his ring. I'm not sure you could even punch a sheetrock wall and leave an impression with your ring,
Yeah.
but the force of the explosion so fierce. So that was a representational target for him, not by name. Other people like Percy Wood, president of United Airlines, Thomas Moser, who headed up a sort of a PR firm that was working with Exxon after the Exxon Valdez had their oil spill in off the coast of Alaska. And so he didn't go after the captain of the oil tanker. He didn't go after the CEO of Exxon. He went after the guy who was handling the account at the public relations firm, trying to make Exxon look a little bit better. And you can agree or disagree whether that should happen or not. The oil spill, of course, was a bad thing, but this bothered Kaczynski so much that he just had to go after that particular guy. And it turns out he didn't like airlines because they were flying over his cabin twice a day at 35,000 feet. He saw the contrails. He didn't know if he was being poisoned or what. And then a sawmill opened up about a mile from where he lived in the cabin. He wasn't in the middle of nowhere in his cabin. He did have a neighbor about a quarter of a mile away, and there was a sawmill that opened up a mile away or so. And he would hear the buzzsaws going, every morning, every afternoon, and that bothered the hell out of him. So who was his last victim then? It was Gilbert Murray, who was a forestry lobbyist working in, of all places, Sacramento. And he just felt that he had to send a bomb to that guy as a representational target. So, I mentioned these in my book, and I do kind of carry through in how these victims were chosen. So, yes, some were random. Others were, there's a Yale University a computer scientist. You look at someone like Kaczynski, and I want to end it here in a little bit of something that I read in a book he cited in the manifesto. But you look at Kaczynski, he got his PhD in mathematics. And, how hard must that be? Harvard undergrad mathematics, University of Michigan master PhD. And this is before computers were allowed to be used. And if you've seen the old movie, not that old, but A Beautiful Mind, the brilliant professor is writing on the windows all the long math formulae. And I remember the day the earth stood still, there's the mathematician writing there, and then the space guy comes in and figures it out for him. So Kaczynski, that's how he was trained. That's how he figured out his math problems. And he did solve apparently one or two math problems that no one else could decipher. He did it, and he published his papers in that regard. He was brilliant. Then by the time he graduates, he's teaching in the late 60s. What's happening in another sphere of academia? Computers are coming about. They're the size of a room at first, but slowly as he's progressing in if you will, at the university, he really didn't progress. But as he's moving along in Berkeley, computers are getting smaller. They're getting more. Every university now has one. You can get time and sit there. And what used to take Kaczynski, weeks or days or hours, whatever, to figure out a problem, now you punch these numbers into a computer. You have it in minutes back then, and then seconds, a few years later. And how much that have bothered him. Again, modern technology. He was a Luddite, or at least subscribed to that anti-technology logic. So how frustrating that must have been. That's why he went after computer people toward the end when he started bombing again after a 6-year hiatus, resuming in 1993. A few of his targets were computer specialists, and including David Galertner at Yale University, who had again half of his hand blown off. And so that's how the targets were selected. They were not random at all. He got their information from the Who's Who book that every library used to have. Remember, as a kid, we'd go in and ask the librarian, "What's the biggest book in the library?" "Well, it's right there, Sonny, but you can't check it out." And it was always a book about a foot thick and about 18 inches wide, never meant to be carried or moved. And you would just go through it, and it's Who's Who, like everyone's kind of famous, semi-famous, in their respective fields in the U.S. And that's how he found their addresses, either work or home addresses, and that's where he'd send these things to his targets.
It sounds like you always look for a motive. What's the motive here? And based upon what you just said, I would have to say his motive was revenge. revenge for people that he thought did him wrong, whether it was real or not. It's what he perceived it to be. Which and I know that they said he was kind of sane, but he did suffer from some mental illness. I think paranoid schizophrenia was he was diagnosed with one that with the psychologist that spoke with him. But you think revenge might have been a big part here, Jim?
Revenge, yes, but the motive was more complex than that. And I mentioned here before in Cold Red, and I'm pretty sure I was the first one to ever sort of codify this with the Unabomber. I didn't make up the word incel. That's someone did in the late 90s, involuntary celibacy. But having read everything Kaczynski ever wrote, his frustration at not having been successful in relationships with a woman, dating or anything, certainly not having intimate relations, he was one of the early incels. And I think he was so frustrated, so torn apart inside with this lack of any sort of interpersonal relationship with a woman, that it just drove him crazy. It just drove him to places where most people wouldn't go. Yet he was a victim of his own solitude, of his own mental inability to, in fact, relate. And he hated his parents when he got older. And I read some of the things he wrote to his parents about great, I'm a supposed genius. You sent me off to Harvard at 16 years of age, but look what you did to my personality. I can't talk to men. I can't talk to women. You've ruined me. And he just, when his father committed, I think his father read enough of these letters. His father committed suicide, and Ted called up his mother. Yeah, well, whatever. He's gone. Is there any insurance money you can give me? I have a project I'm working on, and that was, building his bombs and going to taking buses to San Francisco to drop them off. But you know what? I'm going to read a little section here from my Kindle that I just happened to read in the last few days, and it's from a book. There's only 4 books cited in the Unabomber's manifesto. Ancient Engineers is a novel by L. Sprague de Camp. I read that back in the day about how the pyramids were really built, and whether they're aliens or early civilization. There's a few sort of the 2 other were Crime in America. The 2 other references to articles or books, Crime in America, and then and something related to that. We took a lot of clues out of those over the years. But the other book was nonfiction, and it was called The True Believer by Eric Hoffer, written in the 1950s. And Eric Hoffer was a brilliant person, and I always use him as an example when I'm looking at anonymous threatening communications. And when I teach my classes at Penn West University, or over the years to law enforcement, to FBI, I say, be careful when rendering an opinion on a educational level, because you may think someone writes really nice, and they may, writes really well, big words, great vocabulary, punctuates everything perfectly, and you just assume they have a master's degree or even a PhD. Well, I've learned over the years that a lot of PhD people can't write very well, and I've also learned a lot of high school dropouts can write very well. And Eric Hoffer was one of those. He was a high school dropout, yet he wrote one of the seminal books on mass movements and cults and these types of groups and religious fanaticism that people would belong to. And he actually wrote one section in chapter 41 that even before Kaczynski died, I'm reading this saying, boy, this kind of describes Ted Kaczynski very well. And remember, this is a book Kaczynski cited in the manifesto, writing as the Unabomber, of course. So just going to read a couple paragraphs here, and you'll see what I'm going after. And the chapter heading is The Bored, B-O-R-E-D. So quoting from Eric Hoffer, quote, there is perhaps no more reliable indicator of a society's rightness for a mass movement than the prevalence of unrelieved boredom. And let me just interrupt here. And Kaczynski, in his manifesto, he wanted a mass movement. We should get rid of all of society's trappings and start living in tribes, living in an agrarian society, tribes of no more than 30 people. So this was the Unabomber's mass movement. Picking up again. In almost all the descriptions of the periods preceding the rise of mass movements, there is reference to this. And in their earliest stages, mass movements are more likely to find sympathizers and support among the bored than among the exploited and oppressed. When people are bored, it is primarily with their own selves that they are bored. The consciousness of a barren, meaningless existence is the main fountainhead of boredom. People who are not conscious of their individual separateness, as in the case of those who are members of a compact tribe, that's him, the Unabomber, church, party, etc., are not accessible to boredom. The differentiated individual is free of boredom only when he is engaged either in creative work or some absorbing occupation, or when he is wholly engrossed in the struggle for existence. Where people live autonomous lives and are not badly off, yet they are without abilities or opportunities for creative work or useful action, there is no telling to what desperate and fantastic shifts they may resort in order to give meaning and purpose to their lives. So this guy was living in a cabin, bored as shit, and decided he had to kill people.
So that's what all that means.
It comes down to one aspect of Eric Hoffer describing these types of leaders, these cult leaders, these mass movements. You can apply some of this over the years to some things we're going through now, even going back to COVID, some people saying things back then, and who hated others as much for not getting vaxxed or for being too vaxxed or whatever. And I really think between Kaczynski's boredom in his cabin, because that's when the bombing started, not before then. He did move back to Chicago with his family when the first bombings started. He was making his bombs in the attic. But then throw in the incel category, even living in Chicago, he tried to date one woman he used to work at his brother's company with, and that went nowhere, and that's when the bombing started. So not every bored person, of course, is going to be a serial killer. We know that. But mix in the other complexities of a Professor Moriarty light or like in someone like the Unabomber, you're going to have a strong possibility of the brain just getting so rattled and so addled with these negative thoughts that bad things may happen. It could be a mass shooting, it could be a serial rapist, it could be a serial bomber, like we had with, for the first time in public, saying this, the late Unabomber, the late Ted Kaczynski.
You know, Jim, as we look at this, the Unabomber case was probably one of the highlights of your career. And as such, and now the death of the Unabomber today on June 10th, what does that mean to you, if it means anything?
The Unabomber case had a profound effect on my life personally and professionally. I was away from my home and my family 3 separate trips, 3 to 4 months at a time, some trips back and forth. And my kids were always number one to me. I was on the phone every day, and every time home I would visit them, but it wasn't quite the same. And it led to some estrangement and eventually a divorce in my life. Very difficult. With my kids today, it was great seeing them on a family function, and I'll see them next weekend. So everyone is good in that area. But the Unabomber case certainly played at least somewhat of a role in that particular personal aspects of my life. But professionally, it certainly did too. And that is with me understanding for the first time the value of language and how it can be used in committing crimes and how it can be assessed, analyzed, and then determining how to use that same language in those assessments and ascribe it to a particular person, match it up with his or her writing style, his or her speaking style, determining the threat level involved, whether you know the name, don't know the name, and just learn so much more about that person. We are the products of our entire life experience, and that includes our usage of language. Where you went to school, where you grew up, if you moved around a lot, if you were stationary, did you go to a highbrow school, a mid-level school, somewhere beneath that? Are you a woman? Are you a man? Conceivably, are you transitioning from one to the other? All these things kick in at some point and to some degree in terms of how we use language, both spoken aspects of it and written aspects of it. And a trained linguist can, in fact, learn from people's language. I certainly did in the Unabomber case, and other linguists who came along after me, and some who even were there ahead of me, also realized the value of language from a forensic linguistic perspective, and that whole science opened up not too long after the Unabomber case. And I was glad to be not one of the first forensic linguists out there, but certainly one of the first ones to use it in criminal cases in terms of identifying and arresting and convicting bad guys, and also on occasion, even now in the private sector, working for defense attorneys. And if someone did not write a communication or some language was used which exculpated them from their particular charges or crimes, if the evidence points to it, I'm glad to work in that direction too. So yeah, it definitely changed my life. I think the world of linguistics changed a little bit after Unabomber. Some court cases have been, some court decisions in terms of expert testimony being offered was allowed after Unabomber. I was the first one to ever do that in the case U.S. versus Van Wyck out of the U.S. In the federal courts in New Jersey, and we've been riding high since then. Still needs more work, and AI is confusing things a bit. Chat GPT is, that's a use of language that some linguists are still trying to get around. I'm sure Kaczynski would not have approved of any of that at all, being the hardcore non-computer person that he was. Again, past tense was. And but yeah, in closing here, we're up to, about to our usual hour. Don't feel sorry for Ted Kaczynski. He was a bad guy. And did he have some interesting ideas in his manifesto about the evils of technology, of big business, of capitalism, of leftism, of many other isms out there? Yes, he was the proverbial broken clock, right maybe twice a day. But and if he had chosen some other forum to put his message out there, who knows? He could have been held in high esteem to this day. And we're looking with social media and some features like that perhaps he was right in some cases, but not the price that we as a society had to pay. I still walk into a few post offices around where I live, and the postal people know me, and they know I've written books. I mail them off to people signed, and they just get talking. And oh yeah, I was around in 95, 96 when the Unabomber rules were put into place, and that's when now every time you send a package, any bomb or not bombs, but any liquid in it, any gasoline, any fluids that are dangerous, explosive devices, things like that. So all the rules changed with the Unabomber at the post office and how we mail things. And again, they certainly changed in my life too. But don't feel sorry for the guy. A lot of what he wrote, even in the manifesto, was borrowed from a French philosopher named Jacques Ellul, who wrote also about the technological society. That was his book. And so Kaczynski, Unabomber, wasn't even that original. The only thing he did was he espoused many of the same ideas. But then because he was bored and he also was not successful with women, he decided he had to kill people to get his point across. That's
Jim,
never a good formula.
Jim, I'm going to ask one more question. And I don't know if I'll put you on the spot on this question, but I'm going to ask it anyways. I know you never had the opportunity to come face to face with Kaczynski. But if you did, and you had the opportunity right now to tell him one thing, what would it be? You want to say one thing to him. What would you say?
Usually it's what is the one question I would ask the Unabomber.
Well, you can say one thing. It could be a question or it could be a statement, whatever you want.
You are such a brilliant man, Ted. Probably the most brilliant criminal that the FBI ever came across, and perhaps other institutions. You are the real life Professor Moriarty. Why did you have to kill people that you never met?
It's a great question. One that we'll never know the answer to. But I wish that was one that he would have answered.
Yeah. Well, he tried, to get his point across, and et cetera, but not good enough. Not good enough.
Yeah. Well, with that said, you have any closing remarks, Jim?
No, he's literally taken the answer to that question to his grave, and again, it's no loss to society. We all learned something from it. It's a shame it was at the cost of 3 lives and about 24 people seriously injured and disfigured. I always like learning lessons in life, but not at the sake of other people, and certainly not them being murdered or seriously hurt. So, U.S. and I think international law enforcement is better now. We know how to look at these types of criminals in a slightly different light. If there is writings produced by them, if there are writings produced by them, let's let the experts look at them. And in most cases, let's let the public look at them. Let's let the public know what's out there. First of all, to maybe identify them like we did with the Unabomber case, but also to know what makes them tick. Again, I'm repeating myself here. See something, say something. That's great. Tell us what the hell to look for. Put the manifestos out there, or whatever they're called, writings, diaries. You can cut out names. You can cut out bombing, supplies and materials, things like that. But let us know what makes these people think, and we'll know how to identify the next potential Unabomber.
Absolutely. Well, with that said, we want to thank everybody for joining us for a special episode of Cold Red. And until next time, and we hope you join us again, it's Fitz and Ray signing off. Thank you.
See you, everyone.